Hello everybody, it's now 1 minute after the hour. We're going to go ahead, or after the half hour, we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy day to attend this very timely webinar. My name is Norm Koenig. I'm the SVP of Sales here at Platinum Data Solutions. I've been in the mortgage technology space for 25 years. I've worked with companies like eLinks, SwiftView, and most recently DocMagic. In order to properly thank you all for attending, we're providing everyone a free gift valued at $60. We'll provide details at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Mr. Craig Zelazny. Craig has nearly 14 years of experience in AVMs, mortgage data, and analytics. He's worked with companies like AVMetrics, Equifax, and Huntington National Bank. We feel very fortunate to have Craig head up our Valuation Analytics business channel. He also happens to be the smartest guy in the room, and as you'll see, he's also a great communicator. While Craig and I are not related, we do share the same hairstylist. So everyone, please welcome Craig Zelazny. Take it away, Craig.
Thank you, Norm, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about the steps required to create a compliant AVM program, and that includes the steps for developing and maintaining the program. And there are a couple of different things we're going to hit on today. First, we're going to talk about the regulations that drive the environment. There are some rules out there that are pretty specific about what you need to do and how you need to do it, and we must be familiar with those in order to be compliant in our programs. Two, we're going to talk about AVM testing and validation. This is sort of the foundation for putting together a good program. If you don't test and validate the models correctly and know what that information is telling you, you really have a tough time knowing how to proceed. We'll get into confidence scores, which I think are misunderstood largely. We're going to go into a little bit of detail about how to use them and how to understand them. Fourth, we'll talk about cascades, AVM cascades, and how to make great use of those and the value that they deliver to any AVM program. And then we're going to wind up with policies and procedures, which is really the backbone of this, because from a regulatory perspective, the policies and procedures, the documentation, are going to be the things that the regulators, the examiners are going to look at and scrutinize first and foremost when they come in to see what you're doing. And then we'll wrap up with a summary, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the end. So as we're going through the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in. The GoToWebinar box on the side of your screen has a little spot where you can type questions. Go ahead and do that anytime that something pops into your head, and we'll address those as we move through. Now, the payoff of all this, after we go through the presentation today, you're going to have the information you need to create and maintain a compliant AVM program, and that's really what we're after. So let's talk first about the regulations. There are two primary regs out there that you need to be familiar with. One is the OCC 2011-12 guidance, which is on model risk management. And that's a broad document. It really applies to all models that are used in financial services and banking specifically. And it talks about how to test the models, how to validate them, and some of the broader steps that apply to any kind of model that's being used in a banking environment. More specifically is OCC 2010-42, the Interagency Guidelines on Appraisal and Evaluation. And what we're looking at here is specifically Appendix B, which really gives us the specifics around AVM testing, AVM implementation, monitoring, and things of that nature. Now, the nice thing is that Appendix B of the Interagency Guidelines is only 2 pages long. So we're not talking about an overwhelming amount of information that we have to absorb and understand. So let's talk about the regulations in a little more detail. And what I've done here is I've summarized what those two documents present as it relates to our program. One is that validation is a critical step. You simply cannot get away from it. And we're going to talk about what validation means and how to do it. Two, this has got to be an ongoing effort. You can't do it once and let it go. Validation, testing, and monitoring your program is something that we do continuously. Third, they want you to go beyond the face value. You're going to hear a lot of things from different sources, the vendors and marketing material and so forth, and that's really not sufficient to understand how to use the AVMs and what they mean. You've got to dig a little bit deeper, and you have to do some of that either on your own or with the help of a third party. Another key piece of this is understanding confidence scores, and this is explicitly outlined in the guidance. Confidence scores are such an important part of what happens with an AVM that you must understand how they work, what they're telling you, and how you're going to use them in production. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. Monitoring and auditing the program. Again, we can't put it in place and let it go. You cannot set it and forget it. The guidance is very clear that as you put in place an AVM program, you've got to have steps that on a regular basis show you what's going on, keep track of how you're using the program, what the results are, and that you want on a regular basis auditing what's happening. You want to make this formal, and what I mean by that is you have to document everything. Documentation is what the OCC or any regulator will look at first and foremost. I've been through a handful of these reviews myself, and step one is for them to request any documentation, and that's what they start with. They review it, and then they start to look for holes or missing information. And then finally, and this is not to be overstated, independence is key. The regulators are very concerned about potential conflicts of interest as you look at the different steps in an AVM program, whether it be from testing to scoring to implementation to monitoring. They're very concerned about who's doing what and making certain that we don't have conflicts. So that's what the regulations are telling us in a broad sense. So let's talk about some of these in a little more detail. First is the AVM testing and validation. This is a critical first step. And I say that because without good testing, we don't really know how the models perform, and we can't make good decisions about where and how to use them. But before we get to that, let's take half a step back and talk about what an AVM is. And an AVM, like any model, is comprised of two core pieces. One is data, and the other is analytics. And in the case of an AVM, the data is really public records information. More commonly today, we're looking at multiple listing service, MLS data. And in some cases, you'll find the vendors are always looking for new ways to bring new data into their process. So any information they can get about residential properties, what they've sold for, when they sold for, what the characteristics of the property look like, they're going to look for that. They're going to try to find that new data. And then the analytics are comprised of all the math and statistics that are used to build the models, that are used to express the relationships between what they know about the properties and the actual value. And AVM testing is simply the process by which the AVM models will take a property address, and many of them, in most cases, they will calculate what they believe to be the current value of that property, and then we compare that predicted value to some known value, most commonly a recent sale price, and we determine what that difference is on a percentage basis. We do this over a large sample set, and we begin to understand how the models perform. Now, the slicing and dicing of this is important because although it would be great and easy to look at how a model performs across the U.S., we don't have that luxury. Models perform differently based on the geography, based on the price band. So models will do better with median priced homes that are very common as opposed to those that are in the outlier, very, very low priced or very, very high priced and unique. We also want to understand how the models perform on the basis of property type in many cases. It's not quite the case that it used to be, but sometimes the models will perform better with single-family homes than they do with condos, primarily because there are more transactions, there's better data there. But the slicing and dicing is an important component of looking at how the models perform and doing the analysis. We also want to understand and consider different ways of measuring the performance. So I mentioned a moment ago that the most common thing is to look at the percentage error between the AVM's value and some sort of a benchmark, a recent sale price most commonly. But there are a lot of statistical measures we can look at that will tell us about how the model performs overall or on a geographic basis. And those are things like looking at the mean percentage error, the average, or the median, which is the middle value. We look at standard deviations, which tell us about how volatile the predicted values are. And then you'll hear a lot today about accuracy rates, or a percentage within 10%. So how often does the model come within 10% of the true value? And those are all important to understanding how the models perform and being able to do some comparison of one model to the other. Now here's an interesting chart that actually does represent true AVM performance data that I pulled together. And we've got two models here. This is a tale of two models because they're entirely different. The blue line represents Model A. And you can see that what we have here is a very nice distribution. Now this represents all the errors across a very large sample set. And if you look at the peak of the blue line, Model A, you'll see that most of the errors are somewhere between 0 and negative 5%. So the model has undervalued the true value by about 5%. And it's a nice smooth curve. We don't have too much going on the outsides. It's pretty tight. Model B, the red line, is a different situation. This model, as you can see, the peak occurs at about negative 15%, is undervaluing by 15% or so in the most common scenario. But it also has this situation to the right where there are a lot of properties in this sample where it overvalued by 15 or 20 or 25%. The reason this is important is if you look at metrics alone, single numbers like mean error, the mean error for these two distributions, these two models, may be very, very similar. But until you start to look at what they do across the full spectrum of the data sample, you don't understand where things may be a little out of whack. This chart was one that I put together across a large sample set nationally. The important thing here is this model, or this chart needs to be applied to the geography, to the county, to the price band, whatever. Visually inspecting your data provides a lot of insight. I mentioned earlier confidence scores are such an important part of the AVM world, and having a good understanding of confidence scores is really part and parcel to having a good AVM program. And this also ties back to the requirements for a compliant AVM program. And this is spelled out very clearly in the regs, that you must have a good understanding and a good documentation around the confidence scores and analysis that you've done. What makes this a little bit of a challenge is the fact that definitions differ from model to model. A confidence score is not a confidence score across all models. And because of that, it's difficult to compare them on a like basis. One of the things that the AVM vendors have done in recent years is try to standardize on a forecast standard deviation, or FSD, as their confidence score. And that's fine, except there are a couple of assumptions that are made with a forecast standard deviation. And a forecast standard deviation is exactly that. It's a predicted standard deviation for the data. But it makes two assumptions. One is that the mean percentage error is 0, which isn't always the case. And it makes the assumption that the distribution of that data, like what we saw on the chart just a moment ago, looks like a bell curve. It's normal. And that's never the case. So we want to be careful about even what's presented as a standard in the confidence score world. When you look at confidence scores, it's important to understand that because the definitions differ, we cannot compare them one to one. And the bigger mistake that I see, and I've seen this for 10 years, is that we tend to apply a very academic interpretation of this. So when you see a confidence score of 90 or better, that sort of equates to an A, like when we were in high school, and an 80 or better is a B, and a 70 or better is a C. And a C sounds pretty good. It sounds average. But in reality, based on the way the confidence scores are defined and the way they test out in production and through your testing, a 70 may be horrible, and an 82 might be fantastic. So you can't apply this ABC 70, 80, 90 mentality and have real good rules. The other thing you can't do is assume that the confidence score represents the same relationship in one part of the country as it does another. Confidence scores need to be evaluated at the county level or MSA level, as well as the performance of the model itself. But confidence scores are important because of what they allow you to do in production. So as we put an AVM program in place and we want to actually use the confidence score as a point of decision making on a day-to-day basis, we need to have a good understanding of it. The reason this is key is because it's the only piece of information that we get with the AVM value that allows us to make a decision. So I may get a value of $210,000 on a given property, and the only other piece of information I get beyond that is that I have a confidence score of, say, 81. If I don't understand what that 81 means, I can't use it to make a decision. I can't use it to understand how good the $210,000 may be as a predicted value for the property, an estimate of value. So the bottom line is that when you're looking at confidence scores, like the models themselves, we need to evaluate them empirically. We need to do some analysis to determine what relationships exist between the confidence scores and the model's accuracy. And to that point, I put together a chart here that demonstrates the relationship between the confidence score and, in this case, 3 different measures of accuracy. The blue bars represent the 5% accuracy rate, and that's simply the percentage of observations that occur between -5 and 5%. The red bar is a 10% accuracy rate. That's the number of observations that occur between -10 and +10. And then the green is 15, which is -15 to +15. And as we look at the chart, we see that along the x-axis, the bottom there, the confidence score goes from 73 all the way up to 90. And the y-axis is simply the number of observations that fell into those confidence score categories or buckets. We see that we're getting more and more information, more and more occurrence of high confidence scores in all 3 accuracy buckets, which is good. What's interesting about this and why it's important to look at confidence scores in a detailed fashion is that in this case, while an 86 confidence score isn't quite as good as an 87 and an 88, we see a fall off at the 89 confidence score relative to how frequently we're falling in those 5, 10, and 15% buckets. This doesn't mean it's a bad model. It doesn't mean we want to ignore the confidence score, but it does point us in a direction that we want to dig a little deeper and get some information on what's happening in this particular scenario. So this type of chart where we're looking at how the confidence score relates to some measure of accuracy, and in this case I used accuracy rates, but you can use median absolute errors or standard deviations, and perhaps all of them, will give you some insight as to how predictable or how predictive the confidence score is of the true accuracy. Once you get through testing and you've looked at your confidence scores, you have some understanding of the models and their general performance, we want to look at building a cascade. And a cascade is simply a sequence of models that are run in succession. But in order to build the cascade, you've got to score the models in some way that allow you to rank order them. We have to somehow determine which model is the best performer in a given county, as an example. And you can't do that with a single metric. You can't look at this and say, well, this one model has the best median absolute error, and therefore it's the best model for that county. We need to look at a couple of different metrics because we're matching model performance to our risk profile. And we want to be careful about thinking in terms of hit rate, so how often do we get a value, because that's why we do this, to get a value. But we also want to be thinking about how accurate the model is, what's the model's tendency to overvalue versus undervalue, and what are the trade-offs around those two situations, and so forth. So there are a lot of different ways you can calculate a score for a given model to determine the ranking in your cascade. And in most cases, it's simply a weighted average or a weighted sum of different metrics. So you might put 50% weight on your hit rate. You might put a 30% weighting on your median absolute error. You might put a 20% weighting on your standard deviation, and you might deduct a 20% weighting for overvaluation. But when you add all those up, you can get a score that allows you to rank order your models. And now you've built a model preference table or a cascade, which is simply this rank ordering of the models on a county-by-county basis. The reason we use a cascade, the reason we go through all this effort to get to this point, is because there are several payoffs to having a cascade rather than a single model. The most obvious is that you get a better hit rate. If I've got multiple models in my cascade, I've got the opportunity, if I don't get a hit with the first one, to go to a second model and get a hit with that one. The second point is that we get better accuracy. I'm choosing or figuring out which model is the most accurate or best optimal model to use on a county-by-county basis. And that being the case across a large sample set or a large production set, I'm always running the model that is best suited for my situation. We can also have multiple cascades. We don't have to do everything under one umbrella. So with a cascade, you can score your models one way if you're using AVMs for equity lending as an example, and you can score your models another way if you're using it to value a portfolio. And you can score your models a third way for marketing or pre-qualification activity. So it gives you that flexibility to really tailor your cascade to the specific application. But in the use of a cascade, there are several things you want to be aware of, you want to be careful of. One is to avoid value shopping. And this may not be quite as common today or as big a problem as it was back when AVMs were first introduced. But in any case, the regs are very clear that you don't create a cascade that simply shops for a value. And what that means is you cannot keep running AVMs until you find an AVM that gives you a value that makes your deal go through, that works for the deal. You have to have very specific rules built up front about what's an acceptable confidence score, what's an acceptable scenario, so that when you get an AVM value, it fits and you use it. If it doesn't fit, you don't use it. You just can't keep looking. The second thing we want to be careful of is aggregating our test results and building a cascade at too high a level. In today's world, county-level testing and county-level cascades, that's the norm, and that's what we want to shoot for. But I've seen situations where lenders have taken a cascade for a given county, and because the county right adjacent to that doesn't have enough data to build their own cascade, they simply take the cascade from County 1 and they apply it to County 2. Or they'll take the cascade from one county and they'll roll it up to the entire MSA or to the entire state. And we want to be careful of that. That's not really appropriate. The model's performance at the county level is not extensible to the MSA or to the state. And we want to be careful about how we look at that. And then finally, the thing we want to be careful of is applying this as a one-size-fits-all solution. AVMs and AVM cascades are not a one-size-fits-all environment. That's why it's so important to understand model performance individually, at the geographic level, at a price tier level, at a property type level. There's a lot of work in that, but it's required to be compliant and it's required to give you sufficient understanding of how the models perform so that they can be applied in a responsible way and that you can tailor your program to your specific risk requirements. Policies and procedures are the part of this really isn't quite as much fun, but it is absolutely required. Rule number one in an AVM program is document, document, document. And this really begins at the very beginning of the effort as we're putting together our program and we're talking about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. We want to document who's doing the testing, how are they testing, where did the data come from, what analysis is being performed, who's doing the analysis, and so forth. Everything needs to be on paper. As I mentioned earlier, when the regulator comes in to review your program, the first thing they're going to ask for is your documentation. Show me your policies and procedures because I want to see what you're doing and how you're doing it, and we're going to then talk about whether you're actually adhering to the policies and procedures and whether we need to make changes. So rule number one, document, document, document. Beyond that, though, we're going to ask some basic questions and answer some basic questions as we put the documentation together. And specifically, this is what is being done. What are we doing from a testing standpoint? What are we doing from a validation standpoint? What are we doing from a scoring perspective? How are we analyzing confidence scores? What business rules are in place? How do these things align with our risk profile? What types of loans are we using these for? Anything that pertains to the business and the way the AVMs are being used and how they're being evaluated needs to be documented. We want to talk about how things are being done. We want to talk about who's doing it. And this goes back to the importance of independence. As I mentioned, I've been through a number of OCC reviews, and most recently, here in the last 12 or 18 months, the greatest emphasis was placed on independence. There was a lot of concern about who was doing the testing and validation versus who was scoring the models versus who was building the cascade versus who was maintaining the cascade and who was doing the audit or back testing in production. They want to see independence across all those steps, and that's really a key piece. And then finally, they're going to want to see when everything was done. So timelines are important as well. So as you're documenting all these things, make sure you keep track of the timing around this. How frequently are we doing our testing? When did it occur? How does it relate to our production environment? Did we test 6 months ago with data that was 6 months old and then put it in production today, and we're really talking about information that might be 12 or 15 months seasoned? We need to understand that. But the policies and procedures are key to this whole thing. So we hit a couple of topics here today, and these are the fundamentals we want to get to and maintain as we go through our AVM program and think about compliance. Now, I would suggest, if you're so inclined, to go out to the OCC's website and pull down the 2 documents that we talked about earlier. They're not difficult to read. They're very, very concise, but they give you everything that you need to know relative to the expectations around an AVM program. 2, this is not a set-it-and-forget-it environment. Once we go through AVM testing and validation, we do our confidence score analysis, you must do it on a regular basis. You cannot do it once and put it in place forever. This is going to be a key point for anybody doing a review with you, is are you doing things on a regular basis? Does the frequency of your program coincide with, or is it commensurate with, the volatility in the marketplace? If you're not keeping up with changes, they're going to come after you and make a point of letting you know that you need to do it more quickly and more frequently. 3rd, confidence scores are really key to this. They are the one point of data in the process that we can use to make a decision, and we need to understand AVM performance as it relates to confidence scores. What's the relationship? And can we use confidence scores as part of our decision-making process in production on a day-to-day basis? Cascades are a fundamental piece of any AVM program. They are so much better than any single AVM that using them in all situations is highly recommended. And if you don't go through the testing process, you don't take the time to score the models, you don't take the time to understand your risk environment and how these things align, you cannot build a good cascade. But a good cascade will take you a long way toward having a very good, strong, and repeatable process and program in place. And then finally, policies and procedures. Again, we just talked about this. It's such a crucial portion of what goes on, the documentation, so that the regulators can see it, so that people internally can see it. It's just part and parcel to managing your risk in a very responsible way. And if you don't have all the answers, ask the experts. There's nothing wrong with reaching out for help. The AVM vendors are always ready to answer your questions. They're always ready to help. There are companies like Platinum Data and others who have expertise in this area who are more than willing to help you understand how to go about this process, help you get the data you need, help you do the analysis, and so forth. Don't hesitate to ask for help if that's something that you need to get a good program in place. Okay, here's the big surprise.
Thanks, Craig. Great job. I'm sure that the attendees found great value in the information that you presented today. I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to attend today. The free gift that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation consists of 5 free AVMs. In order to redeem this offer, simply enter your email address in the questions field on the GoToWebinar panel. You may need to click the little white arrow that's on the red field in order to open up the window. But there's a question section. Just enter your email address into that question section, and one of our customer service team members will reach out to you by the middle of next week. Go ahead and advance the next slide, Craig. And then feel free to reach out to us at any time. We're going to leave this contact information on screen during the question and answer session. But I did want to bring your attention to the bottom line there where we say that our next webinar coming this spring is on automated appraisal review and QC. Everyone who attended this webinar will get an invite to this one that's coming up this spring as well. So on to the question and answer. The first question is, I work for a mid-sized community bank that lends in 6 states. On a day-to-day basis, we don't do more than 50 AVMs a month. What is the most cost-effective solution to document that we validate AVMs?
Well, I'm assuming that the use of the AVMs is for lending decisions like an equity loan or line of credit. And in that case, from a cost-effective standpoint, you want to be thinking about a cascade. And again, this goes back to the idea that we really can't skirt the idea of following the guidelines and rigorously understanding model performance and building an optimal solution. And that involves doing the testing and putting in place a cascade. So cost effectiveness is going to be a consideration, but the regulators will not be quite as concerned about that as they will be the accuracy. But in any case, going through the testing process, working with a third party, if you don't have access to that information or the data, find a third party who can help you test, who can help you understand model performance on a county-by-county basis, who can help build a scoring approach that's commensurate with your risk environment and your application, and then put in place a cascade. That's really the best way to go about it.
And I will add also that that's right in Platinum Data's wheelhouse, so we can certainly help you with that if you reach out to us directly. The next one is, how do we learn the intricacies of each individual AVM? Do we go to each individual AVM provider?
Great question, and not necessarily. There are third parties like Platinum that works very closely with all the AVM providers on a daily basis. And this is one of those situations where it's probably most effective not to try to necessarily establish those relationships individually, one-off. I mean, there are 18 or 19 different models out there. Understanding how each one performs and how each one is built and the way it works, it can be a daunting task if that's not what you're in business to do. And so working with a third party who has relationships, who's got experience. I've been doing this for 10 years now and have been involved in many different aspects of it. Find someone who does this every day, who's got the background, and let them help you understand the intricacies and the inside and out of this. That's my advice.
Okay. Next question. Thank you, Craig. Next question is, do you find the data to be flawed as a result of the inflated home values from 2005 to 2008?
That's another great question. It's not such an issue today because home prices have leveled off since then. The models and the modelers, the AVM vendors themselves, do a really great job of staying on top of market changes. However, they can only be so quick. So when the market was, during that time period, changing very, very quickly, we did find the models were lagging a little bit in how they kept up. As the home values dropped very precipitously and very quickly, the models tended to overvalue a little bit. As the market was rising prior to that, rising very quickly, they tended to undervalue. They were chasing the market a little bit. That's a great thing to keep in mind as you're looking at model performance. What's happening macroeconomically? What's happening in the housing market in broad terms? Is there something from a velocity perspective in terms of the change of market value that would lead you to believe the models may not be keeping up or may be lagging in one direction or the other? The data that we're dealing with from 2005 to 2008 doesn't really play a role in today's AVMs. This is 2014, and the models are very, very current. So what we want to be most concerned about are things that may have happened in the last 3 to 6 months in the market, and that not being reflected accurately in the model's ability to predict value.
Excellent. The next question is, can you talk about the best practices for constructing evaluations using AVMs? Are there model forms available?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can we get a clarification? Whoever typed that, could they maybe provide a little clarification on that while we go to the next question?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Next question, can you explain the delivery rules that have been put into place? Is an email receipt now always required, etc.?
I think that question is probably in reference to the recent changes as of January 18th in the Equal Credit Opportunity Act guidelines that require that if an AVM or any valuation is used in the decision-making on a loan, a copy of that document or a copy of that valuation must be provided to the consumer. And yeah, you do have to do that. If an AVM is being used to render a lending decision, then that AVM value must be provided, and an AVM report must be provided to the consumer. And I think that's what they're talking about. So yes.
Okay, thank you. Where do we find definitions of confidence scores and what they mean for each AVM?
Typically, you're going to have to go to the AVM vendors or to a third party to get that information. It varies from model to model, and so there is no one place where that's published. You either need to engage the AVM vendors in a discussion or someone like us, like Platinum, a third party who works with them and understands how these things come together. But there is no single website where you can go and it tells you all this good stuff. You need to seek out people who understand the models and work with them on a regular basis.
Okay. Which AVM solutions factor the current competing activity and pending listings to establish true maximum market potential in a manner similar to the use of competing listings by appraisers?
I'm sorry, Norm, which ones do that?
Yeah, which AVM solutions factor the current competing active and pending listings that establish the maximum market potential in a manner similar to what's
there are several AVMs that are making use of MLS data today. And I don't want to identify them specifically, but it is important to understand how the model is using the MLS data, and particularly as it relates to testing, what kind of a look into the market are they getting with MLS data that maybe somebody who's using public record data only. But suffice it to say there are a number of models that make use of MLS data, and that is an important consideration when looking at the testing and test results and model performance.
Okay. Next question is, the OCC is telling us that we must have a written evaluation of each AVM married to a condition report or property inspection. The two documents alone are not sufficient. A person independent of loan production must write this document. They also say that another individual must review each evaluation. So I don't know if that's a question so much as a comment, but what are your thoughts on that, Craig?
No, I think that makes that it's very logical. I'm not surprised that that was the case. Something that's interesting with the regulators, and I saw this with the OCC, I'm going to assume that it's pretty common with the other regulators as well. It's actually up to the examiner, the individual examiner, to apply their interpretation of some of these guidelines. There is no hard, fast rule necessarily that the OCC or a regulatory body lays down in concrete and says you will not vary from this. There is an interpretation that takes place on a case-by-case basis. So as your examiner was looking at your program and came to the conclusion that these were the steps that they wanted you to take, it was probably in the context of making certain that based on the risk that you were facing or what you were doing with the AVMs, they wanted to see the property condition report along with the AVM report, and they needed to be done in a certain way. That may or may not be a requirement in every situation. I mean, obviously you have to have a property condition report, but the way they look at some of those specifics can vary from examiner to examiner.
Okay. How much caution should be exercised when using AVMs in non-disclosure states?
I don't know if it's a caution relative to using them. This is something that you want to uncover and dig into during the testing and validation phase. As we talked about early on in the presentation, data is a key piece of how the AVMs are developed. It's the fuel for the analytics, and we certainly want to be mindful of the degree and quality of data that's provided or available to the models on a geographic basis. Certainly non-disclosure states do pose a problem as it relates to recent sales and recorded sale activity, prices, and so forth. So this is where you're starting to see that the AVMs try to make greater use of MLS data, and that does create a unique situation relative to testing. So I would say the caution needs to be applied to the evaluation of model performance, the validation phase, rather than not thinking about it until you go into production.
One other question is, are we able to email the presentation slide deck? I don't know if we've given that much thought, Craig, but I know that we will have a video link to the actual presentation. What are your thoughts on the slide deck?
I don't see why we couldn't provide that.
Okay, perfect. And then are there recommended accuracy standards that should be targeted when building out a Cascade solution?
Any kind of accuracy standard needs to be a function of the specific risk profile that you're facing. So I'm going to use kind of an extreme situation here. If we have two borrowers, and one borrower, and these are both for, let's say, equity loans, and one borrower has a 650 credit score, and the CLTV on the proposed loan is 95%. By rules, by guidelines, you may not even use an AVM in that environment. Let's say you are. Certainly, the required accuracy that you need to see in your testing and validation needs to be much greater in that case than if you're facing a borrower who has a 780 credit score and whose CLTV is 50%. That 50% CLTV has a lot of extra equity built in. We're a little less sensitive to the model being off a bit than in a 95% CLTV situation. So the key here is, as you're evaluating model performance and you're looking at how well it performs and what kind of accuracy and consistency there is, it needs to be viewed in the context of how the model is being used and what that risk parameter looks like, what those risk guidelines look like. The riskier the situation, the tighter the performance needs to be. The less risky, you got a little bit of latitude. But if you look at it in that context, you can line those things up and make sure that they interface correctly.
Okay. And it looks like we have a final question here, which is, what are you hearing as it relates to the use of AVMs and PCRs, I guess those are property condition reports, on a standalone basis for home equity lending? Do you expect that approach to continue to be viewed as a compliance solution?
I haven't heard anything recently that would indicate there's going to be a change in that respect. It was a pretty bold move that the regulators took a few years back to require the property condition report, but it seems like everyone's sort of adjusted to that, and they seem to have good programs in place, good processes in place for dealing with that requirement and doing it effectively. I cannot imagine that the OCC will loosen, the regulators in general, will loosen their perspective on this and become less stringent. I don't think the requirement for a PCR is going to go away anytime soon, but I also don't get any sense that they're going to tighten that up and make it any more difficult than it already is. So I think where we are today with the AVM and the PCR together is where we're going to be for the foreseeable future.
All right, well, thanks for that information, Craig, and thanks again for a great job on the presentation. That will conclude today's presentation. Thanks again for your time, and thanks for your business with Platinum Data Solutions. Have a great day, everybody.